folks. Welcome back for another episode of the Light After Trauma podcast. I'm your host, Alyssa Scolari, and this is going to be a good episode. I'm saying this right out of the gate because I adore our guest today. And let's just take a minute to talk about the imposter syndrome, right? This imposter syndrome that so many of us feel like we have. Our guest today is Gina Abbondante. I met Gina actually as a result of the pandemic through a peer consultation group. Gina is a colleague, fellow therapist, incredible human being. So she has her own group practice that she actually just started up this year. And she does a lot, but her specialty is treating anxiety disorders and obsessive compulsive disorder, particularly in pregnancy and postpartum. So when we talk about imposter syndrome, when I met Gina over a year ago, I was so intimidated. This was like before the podcast was even like a blip on my radar, because Gina is just a badass at what she does. And it just radiates. When we first started the peer supervision group, I would just sit back and like listen to like the stuff that she would say. And I have been thinking a while about asking Gina to come on the podcast, but I was scared. Like imposter syndrome took over, and I was like, she's not going to have time for me. She's way too busy. She's not going to want to come on my podcast. And then I wrote this blog post, which I think is ultimately what prompted you to reach out to me, right?
It was, yeah.
So I wrote this blog post on obsessive compulsive disorder. And after writing that, Gina reached out to me. And I, of course, giggled like a school child because I was so excited. And she was like, wow, I thought that you were going to reject me.
Talk about imposter syndrome.
I know, right? So like, here we go. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm glad that you reached out because I was terrified. So can you elaborate a little bit more on like what you do, who you are, what life is like for you? Because you dabble in so many different things.
Yeah, I mean, it's a journey. So I originally started in solo practice just as doing my own thing in 2014, I think. And at the time, I've kind of always specialized in pregnancy and postpartum, mental health, mood disorders, things like that. And also infertility, pregnancy loss, birth trauma, infant loss, all that stuff. And I love it. I just love the population. They've just always been really near and dear to my heart. I have 2 kids, so that probably also plays into it as well. I love it. So I have been in solo practice and then moved into group practice in the beginning of like May 2020-ish, the height of the pandemic, which was nuts, but here we are. And I specialize in anxiety disorders and OCD. I see a lot of it. I mean, I think anxiety is pretty universal. We all experience anxiety at some point in our life.
Oh, yeah.
And for some of us, it does turn into a disorder, which it kind of takes on a life of its own and it becomes a whole other thing. And for some reason, I think, there are a lot of factors that play into it, but I see a lot of anxiety disorders and OCD during pregnancy and postpartum. And then add on top of it, pandemic, it's been a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that is my specialty. I love working with this population. It's so rewarding to see people when they realize and make that click of like, wow, I really can control this. There's nothing wrong with my brain. It's not broken. I can do this. And to really see people get that empowerment and that sense of agency back that they can do it.
Yeah. And it's, one of the things that I remember so clearly in like one of our first peer consultation groups where we were introducing ourselves, and you had said, like, OCD is a beast.
Mm-hmm.
And it resonated with me then, but lately, as my OCD symptoms, as I wrote in the blog post, like, have really been exacerbated, I'm like, oh God, this is a beast. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that OCD is portrayed one way, but I don't
Totally.
think that people truly have a grasp on like its entirety. Like,
Oh
it is
yeah.
not just needing to have an even number on the heat and air or the volume. Like, so could you just first start by like breaking down like what is OCD?
Yeah, absolutely. So OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, it is characterized by having obsessive intrusive thoughts that create anxiety, essentially, and compulsive actions that we do to neutralize the anxiety. And that is, if we're talking about how OCD is ever sort of miscategorized or misseen, that's it. Is like we often only from the outside, people categorize OCD as just your compulsions, and it's really not. So it's not just needing things orderly or needing things clean, or it's not just that. Compulsions take up such a range of things. It's not just physical compulsions, there's also mental compulsions, which are a huge aspect, and I think not seen quite as much. To me, no matter what the DSM says and where it is in the DSM, it is an anxiety disorder. It originally was seen and characterized as an anxiety disorder. At some point along the line, the powers that be decided it needed its own part in the DSM, and I still think
Right.
that's nuts. It's an anxiety disorder.
It is. Yeah.
So it is characterized by obsessive intrusive thoughts and the compulsive actions that we take to neutralize or get away from that anxiety. OCD has a few different subtypes or sort of categories underneath of it. There is the straight up OCD, and then there's something called pure O or pure OCD, which usually is seen as someone doesn't have physical compulsions, they just solely have mental compulsions. A lot of times it's seen as just having intrusive thoughts. That's baloney. Everyone that has OCD has some kind of compulsion, even if it is a rumination or it's been mental checking or things like that.
So when you say a mental compulsion, like, can you give an example of what a mental compulsion is? Because I've not heard that term before.
Yeah, absolutely. So mental compulsions are they are things that we do to try to get away from when we have physical compulsions, right? There's the things that we do with our hands or the things that we say. But mental compulsions usually it's mostly around rumination. So we ruminate over a problem, mostly the thoughts that we have, meaning we try to figure out our thoughts. We try to figure out if they're going to happen or if they're going to come true. We try to prove them true or false. We try to analyze how we feel about the thoughts.
Okay.
Other mental compulsions can look like checking. So we check on our sensations inside of our body. Like, do I feel anxious now? Do I feel more anxious now? It can be really just anything that draws attention to or brings the focus back to the anxiety and the thoughts that we're having. And they are I have to tell you, they're very, very challenging to treat because it becomes a habit. And a lot of times, those mental compulsions that we have end up, they're a habit. They're things that we've been doing for long before the anxiety was and the intrusive thoughts were ever present.
Right. Right. So it's very, very difficult to treat. Okay. So then you were saying, so there's two different subsets of OCD?
Yeah. So those would be like I still categorize it as OCD. I don't really delineate between OCD and pure O. I think they're all the same.
Right.
But underneath of that, in the OCD community, there is a tendency to look at the subtypes of OCD. Again, it's all OCD. One is not better than the other, but we look at the different subtypes. So there's a bunch. We see contamination OCD, which is that's actually broken down into two categories also. So it would
Oh,
be,
geez.
yeah, the thinking of I'm going to be contaminated and get sick or be poisoned or something like that. And then there's also the contamination of I'm going to feel disgusting or that disgust based contamination, and I won't be able to shake that feeling of being disgusting. There is sexuality OCD, where people get caught up on thoughts on whether or not they are straight or gay, if they're a transsexual or not. There is scrupulosity or religious OCD, where that really focuses on the morals, whether we're doing something right or wrong. Have we broken the law? Are we sinning? That sort of thing. There's harm OCD, which is intrusive thoughts about harm coming to us or people that we love, either by ourselves or the world at large. That would be things like, am I going to drive and get in a car accident? Am I going to hurt my child? There's a knife. Am I going to stab my child? Am I going to stab my loved one? There's also suicidal OCD falls under the harm OCD. There's pedophilia OCD, where people worry that they're a pedophile or not. There's existential OCD, where we have thoughts, these existential thoughts of, am I stuck in a glitch? Am I in a video game? Is this life real? Am I alive really right now? Or am I dreaming? So there's quite a few different, really anything that can create anxiety can be categorized into some sort of a subtype.
Wow. I had no clue that there were so many subtypes. And I realize that it's such a huge beast, but I think that the way they teach it or the way it's in the DSM, which for the listeners out there, as I'm sure many of you know, is like the holy grail of where we find mental health disorders. It's a human being or a group of human beings decided that this is, if you have these symptoms, this is what disorder you have.
Yeah, it's a Bible, so to speak.
Right, exactly. So we take it with a grain of salt, but when it's in the DSM, it is not like that. It is not described to be as, what's the word I'm looking for? Like debilitating as it truly is. Can you speak a little bit on how, I know for me, when I was younger, it started out just like washing my hands, like to the point where my skin was just bleeding all of the time. And then as I got older, my OCD shifted and it became much more debilitating. So can you talk about some of the ways in which it can be like, I mean, really like knock you off your feet in terms of like your ability to function?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I look at the debilitating factor in two ways. It's the anxiety, and then it's the actual compulsions. So I think the anxiety alone can be debilitating, where people feel so overcome with fear of their own minds, their thoughts, become afraid of the things that we think, that alone can become debilitating and cause people to feel like they just get sucked into their own thoughts. And then on top of that is the compulsions, that some compulsions are so time consuming that people can't leave the house, that they can't function on a day-to-day basis. If somebody has a contamination OCD issue where they are concerned that they're going to pick up AIDS from a door handle, and so they're sanitizing the door handles in their house repeatedly, but they have to get it just right. And if they don't do it just right, they have to start all over again. I've had clients that it takes several hours to leave their house because of all of the compulsions and the things that they have to do. physically. And for those that have more mental compulsions versus physical compulsions, it literally pulls you away from your life. You just get this feeling of like you're locked in your brain in all of these thoughts and trying to prove whether or not they're going to happen. And what does this mean about me? And I feel differently about that thought now. What does that mean? Like you just get so stuck in your own brain. You just really lose touch with your own life. It's awful.
Yeah, it's like the world is happening in front of you, but you are disconnected and stuck in your own mental compulsions.
Yeah. I mean, I can look at it. So from my own aspect, I have anxiety, I have OCD. I've had anxiety my whole life. I mean, since I was a child. The first panic attack I remember having was when I was in kindergarten. So it's been a feature of my life since I was really young. Mostly it would be sort of like pegged onto things that created stress. So school was really hard for me when I was younger. Going to school, tests were really hard for me. Anything that required me to perform or do something really proved to be difficult for me. I didn't develop OCD until really just a few years ago, which is hard. It's hard to be one thing or be one way your whole life and then wake up and be like a completely different person. And it really rattles you.
Wow, so you only just developed OCD a few years ago.
Yeah. I mean, listen, we all have intrusive thoughts. That's just sort of
Yes.
a facet of being a human. It's just those fucked up thoughts that we have as human beings.
Yes, let's normalize that. We
Oh,
all
yeah.
have intrusive thoughts, and it doesn't mean you're fucked up.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's just the way our brain works. Our brain is an amazing machine, but it also does some really bizarre things.
Yep.
So I tell people all the time, like anytime that you're standing on a train station platform and you have that thought of like, I could just push this person in front of me and on the tracks, that's an intrusive thought. But most
Mhm.
people that don't have sticky minds or anxiety can just kind of be like, oh, that was weird and keep it moving. Whereas people that have anxiety and OCD, they get stuck on that thinking there's something wrong with me. Oh my God, I'm having these thoughts. What's the matter with me? So we all have intrusive thoughts. And of course, I had intrusive thoughts my whole life, as the rest of us. But it wasn't until a few years ago when actually my family, my husband and my kids and I, we went down to Disney, and I had like a really massive panic attack on the way down. And from there, I started ruminating on, oh my God, what does this mean? Am I going to ruin this trip? I don't want this. And just really struggling with the anxiety that raised my anxiety, and it lowered my threshold for being able to manage the intrusive thoughts.
Mhm.
And we were walking in Disney and in our resort, I mean, and I remember having this really big flush of anxiety thinking about having to take the boat from our resort to the Magic Kingdom the next day. And in response to that flush of anxiety, I just had this intrusive thought that said, if this anxiety keeps up this way, you're going to end up killing yourself. And that was it. I was off to the races. I ruminated the entire trip thinking, oh my God, I'm a therapist. What does this mean about me? Have I been depressed this entire time? I'm in Florida. I don't know the mental health system down here. Do I need to fly home? Am I going to ruin this trip for my kids? Like, what is the matter with me? Just, I was off to
You're
the races.
gone. Yep, that thought train has left the state. It has taken off. Yep.
Absolutely. And it's a wonder that I don't exactly know how I got through that trip, because it was just like anxiety at a 20, not even a 10, like over the top, you know?
Ugh.
But I did. I managed it. And it's interesting looking back, my kids they never noticed anything was off, which just speaks to the amazing, like, actor ability of people with anxiety. Like, we're
Yes.
suffering inside, but outside, mostly people have no idea what's going on.
No idea. Yep. Your kids had no clue, and here you are. And it's like, boom, onset of OCD.
Uh huh.
suicidal, like I'm going to kill myself if this anxiety doesn't go away. It's like, oh God, that's
Mhm.
horrifying.
Yeah. And from there, I spent the next good, probably, I would say 10 months, almost a year, just ruminating endlessly. And when I tell you, I know, and I tell my clients this, I'm very open with it. I know that feeling. I know that feeling of your anxiety being off the charts. You're afraid of your own thoughts. You can't trust yourself. You're locked inside your own head. I would tell people I felt like my brain was on fire because it's
Uh-huh.
exactly what it feels like,
Yes.
just these thoughts running through and like, what does this mean about me? And am I dangerous? And trying to figure it out. And then this weird thing happens sometimes where you almost pretend like the thoughts are true and you respond emotionally that way. So then I became depressed and oh my goodness, it was awful.
Absolutely. I mean, I relate to that so much, just the thoughts about the obsessions about like, am I have lots of obsessions about like, am I the perpetrator when it
Mm,
comes to being a survivor of sexual abuse? It's lots of like, well, I'm the perpetrator, like I did this. And then I
right.
behave as if I am one
Mhm.
in the sense that like I close myself off from the world.
Exactly.
So all of a
Exactly.
sudden my thoughts have become my reality. And I'm
Yes.
like, I'm bad. I have to go away. And then I don't talk to anybody.
Right. Exactly. It's so awful. I mean, what I say is that it is the closest that I feel like I have ever come to having a nervous breakdown because it was just so scary on a day-to-day basis, which I think is also a very important thing that I think a lot of even some OCD specialists don't really touch on is the trauma associated with having an OCD flare up or the onset of it is so scary. And the fear that I hear from my own clients and even from myself is this constant fear of, oh my God, is it going to get bad again? Is it going to come back? Can I handle it again?
Mhm.
Um, and I feel like even long after, the exposure and response prevention therapy, and once that is over, that pervasive feeling of, oh my God, is it going to come back again? That is trauma. That is like the underpinning of the trauma response of having OCD.
So what you're saying is it's not necessarily that a history of trauma is linked to OCD. It's more that having OCD can cause trauma or both.
I think it can happen both ways. Yeah, I think it can happen both ways. I mean, I certainly have seen my fair share of clients that have trauma history and develop OCD because of their trauma history. I have clients that didn't have a prior trauma history and developed trauma because of their experience with OCD. I think it can happen both ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that when I was little and I had like, I guess more so like the contamination OCD,
Mm-hmm.
at that point, I didn't necessarily have a history of trauma.
Right.
So, but now as I get older, I have intrusive thoughts of seeing my loved ones dead. Like that
Right.
is the most upsetting thing in the world. It is truly traumatizing.
Yeah.
And, going through an episode where think what was this had to have been just a couple of nights ago. My OCD, my intrusive thoughts are through the roof. Trigger warning for anybody who's listening, intrusive thoughts. So it was just a couple of nights ago because I'm in the process of coming off. I was on Klonopin
Okay.
for a while and I'm in the process of coming off the Klonopin. And the rebound effect of coming off of any kind
Mm-hmm.
of benzodiazepine is like anxiety through the roof. So
Oh
my
yeah.
intrusive thoughts are coming back. And the other night, I was looking at my family, like my dogs, and I was just seeing everybody dead
Mm-hmm.
and the worst kind of dead. And the horror that endured from those images, right? Nothing happened. Like, I just had that visual. And then
Mhm.
the entire weekend, I was down for the count,
Yep.
hysterically crying, trying to do anything I could to erase the images from my mind. Like,
Which is
that's
a
the
mental
level.
compulsion. Which is a mental compulsion.
Yes. Yes.
And that's the other thing, is that a lot of times we think intrusive thoughts have to be thoughts, they have to be words. It's very often images, it's pictures,
Yes. That's a
it
very good thing to point out. Yep.
totally. I see from my own experience, I couldn't look outside and see a tree and not have an image of myself like hanging from it, which was terrifying. I couldn't walk into my kitchen and see a steak knife sitting on the counter and like have these intrusive images of me like cutting myself or hurting myself. It's just relentless. It was absolutely awful. So I think that's important as well, is so a lot of people get tripped up on thinking, oh, these are thoughts. That means it has to be thoughts. It doesn't have to be. It can also be urges as well. People get intrusive thoughts can come as intrusive urges, which happens.
Like an urge to do an action.
Hmm. Yeah. It could be in response to having a physical sensation and then having an urge to, I need to do this compulsion. I need to, or even the feeling of, I'm having this fear of, oh my gosh, this awful thing is going to happen. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it right now. Like, for instance, when I have clients that are postpartum and they're changing their baby's diaper, they might have a fear of, oh my God, what if I'm changing my baby's diaper and I sexually abuse them? What if I do it right now? Or giving their baby a bath and they think, well, I could just push this baby under the water. Okay, what if I do it right now? It can feel like urges, which is really scary for people as well.
It's so important to hear you say that, like, and say things like that out loud, because I think that there are thousands, millions of people who have these thoughts
Hmm.
and don't feel like they can tell a single soul because of the shame.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Shame and guilt is a huge motivating factor in what keeps OCD hanging around for longer as well. Just having shame of thinking there's something wrong with us, that we're bad, that we're evil, that we're fucked up in some way.
Mhm.
It feeds that anxiety spiral as well of thinking like, oh my God, there's something wrong with me. I can't tell someone about this because they're going to want to lock me up, or they're going to want me to go to a mental hospital, or they're going to take my kids away from me, or they're going to whatever.
Yep.
I think that's what keeps people that have these thoughts and have these compulsions quiet and in secret for so long.
Yes, especially people who have kids,
Oh, yeah.
or even younger people who live at home with their families who don't necessarily understand mental health. And I think that in treatment, one of the most healing moments is when the person is able to speak the thought
Hmm.
and have the therapist not blow up and be like, "Oh my god, that's
Yeah,
horrible."
absolutely.
That is, I think, probably one of the most healing moments in therapy. Now, when it comes to like the treatment for OCD,
Hmm.
obviously, one of the most well-known treatments is like the exposure.
Yeah. So the gold standard is exposure and response prevention, which what that really means is we expose ourselves to the things that create anxiety. That's the exposure part. And the response prevention part means that we don't allow ourselves to do the compulsions to neutralize or get away from the anxiety. So, what that might look like is, again, if you have someone that maybe has health anxiety or health OCD, that they have a belief that they're going to have a heart attack, Their compulsion might be that they take their pulse multiple times a day. They're checking in on their heart. It would be allowing those thoughts, oh my God, I might have a heart attack, and not allowing them to check their pulse. And what that does is it teaches our brain that we can feel afraid and be safe at the same time. So our amygdala, which is that fancy part of our brain that creates the fear response, that's what makes us feel afraid. And because the feeling is so intense, we then believe we are unsafe. And that's why we do the compulsions, is so that we make ourselves feel safe, so we're not quite as afraid. By taking away the compulsions, because compulsions are what feed the anxiety. When we look at OCD treatment, the intrusive thought part and the anxiety part is not the problem. The problem is the compulsions and the behaviors that we do to get away from feeling anxious. So a lot of therapists will say, if you can do one part of therapy for OCD, it's just treat the compulsions. Just move away from doing the compulsions. Let the exposure part, every day is an exposure. For most people, opening their eyes in the morning is an exposure. So you don't have to plan too much. The most important part is holding back on doing the compulsions.
It's so difficult. I don't know. I just even think back to like last night when I was leaving my office. I have this compulsion right now where like I light a candle in my office and I will look at it before I leave to make sure it's blown out. We'll leave and then not believe that I saw that it was blown out. So then I have to drop my stuff, unlock the door again, go back in, look at it, then lock up again, go to my car, and still I have to force myself to go to my car because I could just go back 10 times and keep looking at that candle.
Right. That's called unproductive reassurance. So two of the most common compulsions that we see with OCD are actually not physical at all. Well, one of them is kind of physical. Avoidance and reassurance seeking. So avoidance is obvious, right? So anything that we're afraid of, we just don't do it. So anything that creates anxiety, we don't do it. If we don't do it, that makes the anxiety drop way down. Oh, done. We're fine. We don't do that again.
Yep.
Reassurance is very sneaky, especially in the days of the internet, because Googling is probably number one of the reassurance seeking compulsions. Anytime we put into Google, why do I feel? Or why is this happening?
It's not a good idea. Never.
Totally. Never. It never goes anywhere good because there's nothing on the internet's going to be able to say, you're totally fine. It's just OCD. Like,
yep. There's not one website out there. Maybe you should make one that pops up.
Oh my gosh, that'd be great. I'd be a millionaire. Well, probably not. People wouldn't like it. They would look for another answer that they want.
Exactly. Exactly.
But it's really hard. Like that reassurance seeking. We look at reassurance seeking in two ways. Productive reassurance, which means you can go to the internet, like if you're learning how to build a birdhouse or something. You look for your instructions on the internet, you get a plan, you execute your plan. That's productive reassurance. Unproductive reassurance is kind of like what happens when people check, which is, okay, I've gone, I see that I blew it out, I walk away, but I don't remember, I'm not sure, I can't handle that uncertainty, I'm going to go back and check again and again and again and again. But because it was never about really checking, it was just about getting away from that sensation of anxiety and uncertainty that was driving it.
Yeah. Now I'm wondering, as I'm hearing you talk, I'm wondering, how did this work for your treatment with the thoughts of committing suicide? How does treatment work with that? Because you can't necessarily do, like, I don't know. How does treatment work with that?
Yeah. So it was really hard. It got to the point where I would, let's talk about unproductive reassurance. I would Google TV shows before I watched them to make sure that there was no themes of suicide in them. I couldn't even like listen to the radio because like if Nirvana came on the radio, it would spin me the fuck out. So it started with things like that, where I would purposely listen to songs that had themes of suicide or a band member had committed suicide. Um,
Okay.
and I had to listen to them and let the anxiety come and go and not engage in, mostly it was avoidance for me. So I had to not avoid, just sit, let the anxiety come, let the anxiety go, and kind of teach my brain, no, this is okay. It's still safe to do this. And then it built from there. I did a lot of, for me, it was a lot of imaginal scripts. So I would write out scripts of what my worst case scenario was in my head of, okay, worst case scenario is this anxiety continues on. I become non-functional. I can't leave the house. I can't take care of my kids. My husband is resentful and angry with me. I can't work anymore. I fall into a deep depression. And because I fall into a deep depression, I ultimately become suicidal and feel like this world is hopeless and this life is not livable. And I follow through on my thoughts. And I would have to write that and then read it over and over and over and over again, because the anxiety would do the same. The anxiety would come up, it would spike, and I would have to practice my not allowing myself to compulse, meaning I couldn't avoid, I wouldn't allow myself to ruminate. So it was just sort of like a bit of a different approach, because there's not a whole lot of like physical things that you can do when you have a fear of suicide.
Right. And that was what I was asking, but I guess it's kind of getting almost creative with the type of exposure, because it's a different type of OCD than just
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, you have to touch this door handle and then sit with it.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, it sounds like what you're pointing out is that, right, nobody can stay in a chronic state of anxiety forever.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So the goal is repetition until
Exactly.
your body regulates.
Yeah. So the rule is any emotion, even the good ones or the ones we judge as good, only last in our body for 90 seconds. Anxiety follows the similar suit. It has a very definitive pattern. It starts, it rises, it peaks, it falls off, and it goes away. And that happens in 90 seconds. If we can ride that out without feeding the anxiety. So how do we feed the anxiety? We feed it with those what if thoughts. We feed it with more intrusive thoughts. We feed it with ruminating over whether or not these things are going to happen. If we don't feed it and we just let it be, it will cut off, and we teach that part of our brain, oh, wait, I didn't have to do X, Y, or Z thing. The anxiety left on its own. Okay. The funny thing is, though, as I very well know this, we can learn fear and a fear response in 2 seconds, but it takes way more, like wildly more time to unlearn a fear in our brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Isn't that a bitch?
It really
It's
is. My
such a
God.
bitch. I know. It's like, what the fuck, man?
It really is.
Yeah. It can take a split second for that like fear to start up, but to be able to get it to go away is work upon work upon work. But the
Mm-hmm.
point is that you can recover from OCD.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I will give this caveat though. So people come to me and they say, what does recovery from OCD look like? And people don't usually like my answer when I tell them this. Because a lot of times people want the answer of, yep, you're going to wake up, you're going to do all this, and you're going to have no anxiety anymore. And you're never going to have another intrusive thought either. You're going to be
Yeah.
healed. It's going to be sunshine and rainbows and puppies, and you're going to be great. And that's not how it works.
Yep.
What recovery from anxiety disorders and OCD looks like is you learn how to be anxious better. You learn how to become non-reactive to the anxiety. You learn how to become non-reactive to the intrusive thoughts that come. You learn how to be anxious better.
And I would imagine that there's also like ebb and flow to it where like there are certain things that trigger it. Like when there are really
Mm-hmm.
stressful moments of your life, it may be much harder.
Mm-hmm.
But as time goes on, just like you said, you learn to be anxious better.
Yeah. And yeah, there's totally going to be times of stress, and there's going to be things that trigger it. And you might have a pop-up intrusive thought that's like totally you weren't expecting. And it does spike anxiety, but we use our skills. We know what to do. We do the same thing every single time so that we don't really have to think about it too much. Even just yesterday, I was going to pick up my daughter from school. I was a few minutes early, so I parked in the parking lot across the street because my daughter's school is weird. You can't go in until it's time for pickup. And there was a teenager, I'm guessing he was like late teens-ish, in the parking lot alone playing loud music. And immediately my intrusive thoughts went to, oh my God, what if he's a school shooter? Because that's a huge thing of mine in my harm
Yep.
OCD world. And I wasn't expecting it. And I noticed it. It caught my awareness. And I did the same things I do every time. Okay, we know what to do. You sit here. You let that anxiety come. You let that anxiety go. You are not going to ruminate over this. Ruminating is a huge compulsion of mine, but I'm not going to ruminate over this. I am going to act as if everything is okay, let my thoughts come and go, and do what you need to do. So it's a practice. It's a thing that we have to make those behavior and lifestyle changes and stick with them.
A very difficult one,
Mm-hmm.
but one that can be done nonetheless.
The way I look at it is it's awful, and I would not wish this on my worst enemy, but there are worse things.
Yes, but also the discomfort of recovery, of going through that process, I still think is easier than staying in a world where OCD runs your life.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. Because it really is. It's all encompassing. If you think of like Howard Hughes, who was like the epitome of someone with OCD, he devolved into a world where he couldn't leave his house because he took 17 showers a day, and
Mhm.
he just devolved into a world of his own madness. And that's totally possible with having
Yeah.
OCD, you know?
Oh, yeah. Yep. When it's unchecked, that's what it can become.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did you decide, did OCD become a huge passion of yours after you had that moment in Disney, or were you already very passionate about OCD prior to even knowing that you had it?
Sort of a little of both. So, because I had always specialized in anxiety disorders. So it had always been on my radar as a passion. Like, it's really interesting that I see so much of this. Because I also say, because anxiety is, or OCD is an anxiety disorder, I have yet to meet anybody walking on this planet that has any other anxiety disorder and doesn't have a compulsion. So that's where it kind of the overlap comes in. So I had
Yeah.
been doing ERP and exposure therapy with clients for years because I would see so much of it in just the regular population of my clients. And then it was interesting. You would think that by knowing what to do, that when you start to experience yourself, you know what to do, and you don't. The short answer is you don't.
You just don't. Yep.
It's a very different thing to be able to do it for someone else. But when it comes to you and ourselves, I was in the weeds. So that sort of renewed my passion for it, for getting to that place of like, oh, wow, I
Now
knew
I get
what,
it.
yeah, like I knew what panic attacks were before, but now I know what this is like. And oh, this is a whole different thing.
Whole different ball game.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. So now your group practice, are you accepting new patients right now?
We are. So we have, it's myself and I have another therapist who also specializes in OCD. We all have our things that we are interested in, our population, so to speak, but we are accepting new clients. We have some clinicians that specialize in adolescents, which is huge because there's so many adolescents and kids that need therapists and just not enough therapists to go around.
Yes. Not enough adolescent therapists out there. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
sure.
That's for sure. And it's change of mind counseling. Is that correct?
Yes, it's change of mind counseling.
So I will definitely pop that into the show notes for anybody who is listening today who is interested. Obviously, from the conversation, you can tell Gina knows her shit. I learned a lot today. A
Oh, thanks.
lot about OCD. So thank you for coming on the show and for being vulnerable because I think it's really hard, and I know we were talking a little bit about this like prior to recording, but I think it's really hard to be vulnerable as a therapist because there's just this like, I don't know, idea that like therapists are
That we have our shit together? Yeah, that we have our
right.
shit together, and which is like furthest from the truth. I mean, listen, we didn't get into this field because we're like these epitome of perfect mental health. We got into it because we're struggle with our own shit.
Right. I'm not the portrait of mental health over here. So yeah, no, there's this idea that we just like are not affected and that we have all the answers to life. And it's like we don't and we struggle. And I think it takes a lot to just like break down that barrier and just say, like, hey, no, I'm a human too. And part of you going through this and you being in recovery is part of what makes you, I think, such a good therapist.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I think it's the relatable aspect. I think people want to hear their story. They want to hear other people have been through a similar experience to them and they're not alone. And I try to normalize that as much as possible. And I'm very open with my clients about that I have OCD, that I'm in recovery from it. Some days are better than others. And I think that's really important because I think we have to normalize the struggle, that it's normal to have days that are good and some days are bad. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that it's going to be all good or all bad or what if that means something about you and your recovery journey. And I think that's super, super important.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most powerful parts of the therapeutic relationship is like the ability to just kind of like be a human.
For sure.
So thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It was great.
Thanks for listening, everyone. For more information, please head over to lightaftertrauma.com, or you can also follow us on social media. On Instagram, we are at lightaftertrauma, and on Twitter, it is at lightafterpod. And if you're on Facebook, please be sure to join our Facebook group. It is a private community where trauma survivors are able to connect and chat with one another. That Facebook group is called Light After Trauma, so just look us up on Facebook and be sure to join. Lastly, please head over to patreon.com/lightaftertrauma to support our show. We are asking for $5 a month, which is the equivalent to a cup of coffee at Starbucks. So please head on over again. That's patreon.com/lightaftertrauma. Thank you, and we appreciate your support.